I suppose the first thing I should really clear up is people talk about diabetes. There are two types, aren't they? Very specific and very different.
Two types of diabetes. Type 1 diabetes usually affects people under the age of 40. It's where the pancreas doesn't produce any insulin, and you often see people inject themselves with insulin or with an insulin pen. And then type 2 diabetes, which is the most common form of diabetes, usually affects people over the age of 40. It's otherwise known as mature onset diabetes. It's where the pancreas is producing some insulin, but not enough to keep the body's energy levels going. And that's really related to lifestyle factors. Healthy eating is so important in controlling your blood glucose levels within diabetes.
I was reading some statistics the other day, and I confess I can't remember exactly what they said, but that the number of type 2 diabetes, the numbers have simply rocketed.
Absolutely. There's an epidemic of diabetes, one GP said to me in Birmingham. I work for Diabetes UK. Diabetes UK is the largest patient organisation representing people with diabetes. But what we want to do is get to the 600,000 people walking around with a condition that don't yet know they've got it. They can have type 2 diabetes up to 9 years before they get diagnosed.
Wow.
And it can lead to some very serious complications.
9 years, I mean, that is a long time, isn't it? So what are the symptoms? I mean, if, you know, you say it could be 9 years, it could be anybody. What are the signs?
Yeah, there's some very obvious symptoms for diabetes, which could be something else as well, but combination of these symptoms, which is going to the toilet a lot, drinking a lot, pints and pints of water, slow healing of cuts and wounds, blurred vision. Diabetes is the leading cause of blindness in people of a working age. It's a leading cause of renal failure. You're more likely to have a heart attack, stroke or lower limb amputation. So the sooner people get diagnosed, they recognise those symptoms, they should really go along to the local GP or local pharmacy and get a test for diabetes.
I suppose it's one of those things where you have a symptom like this and you don't feel so good, or you've got one or two of those, and then a few days later you feel okay.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, they're only indicators that you might possibly have type 2 diabetes, but the sooner you get diagnosed, the sooner the GP or practice nurse who deliver 80% of diabetes care can help you manage your condition.
And okay, so you go to the GP and they say, yes, we think you've got type 2 diabetes. We run some tests. What do they do then?
They basically run some tests to see what your blood glucose readings are like, and if they're in the range where you are diagnosed with diabetes, then they'll hopefully advise some perfect health care for you to manage your condition, to control your blood glucose levels. They should refer you to a dietitian, because obesity is the single biggest cause of diabetes, so it's really important to control what you eat healthily. 5 fruit and veg, low sugar, low salt, low fat, high fibre, all the usual really healthy eating things that dietitians and healthcare professionals advise. And then they'll also say, look, you need to control your blood glucose levels, do some regular exercise. Instead of getting a bus, if it's a few hundred yards, go and walk, get some exercise. And the problem is these days, and more young people are getting diabetes because they're sedentary lifestyle as well. PlayStations, Xboxes, they really need to be getting out there, eating healthy and doing more exercise.
You don't need to go so very far, and within 100 yards of this studio, I can think of 4 places you can walk in. You can get a baguette, you can get hot pastas, you can get slices of pizza, you can get cream cakes, you know the form. And that's part of the problem, isn't it? It's the fast aspect of our lives. We expect everything instantly. We want food, so we go in and we eat things like that, and it's not doing us any good, is it?
That's exactly right. Ready-cooked meals are also full of fat and content. And the key messages when people are diagnosed is make sure you eat healthily, make sure along with that you take regular exercise. And it is buying the healthy foods, it is doing the regular exercise. That's really going to help you avoid the risk of developing those complications I mentioned.
So presumably we've got to prevent, and it's always better, isn't it, prevent rather than cure. I mean, how do you get the message out there? You've got leaflets here with you, there's magazines, it's everywhere. It's not as though people don't know about it, but do they choose to ignore it? Is that the problem?
I think it's a combination of those factors. I mean, more people are getting diagnosed. In Walsall, we've got 17,000 people who are diagnosed with diabetes. There's probably about 2,000 or 3,000 walking around, possibly overweight. Other risk factors that need to be taken into consideration are if you've got a family history of diabetes, if you've got, if you come from an ethnic background as well, you're more likely to develop diabetes. If you've got a large waist circumference for a woman or a man, they're all high risk factors of diabetes. And we're running with Public Health England and NHS England a prevention programme, 5-year prevention programme, which is looking at trying to get to people before they're diagnosed with diabetes, trying to look at Weight Watchers, healthy lifestyle factors that will hopefully reduce the chances of them developing diabetes, and if they develop diabetes, the complications that emanate from them.
And if you don't do anything about it, what's going to happen then?
Worst case scenario, as we just said, Bob, people can be up to 9 years undiagnosed. The longer they go undiagnosed, the less likely they are to control all those factors, and leading cause of blindness in people of working age, leading cause of kidney failure. They're the worst case scenarios, but if people are caught in time, they then self-manage their condition sensibly, and hopefully they'll reduce their chance of developing those complications. Do
we kind of really need, sort of drop-in centres or a day at the town hall where everybody can go in and be checked? If you walk past, you can just go in and they can run a check and tell you how you're doing. It's like a sort of cholesterol check level, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the NHS are supposed to be doing health checks for everybody, offering health checks for everybody across the whole of the UK. It's not happening everywhere. So in which case, the clinical commissioning groups who are responsible for local care delivery, they should be impressing people to go along and get an NHS health check. NHS health checks generally will pick up people with diabetes. That's one mechanism. The other thing that Diabetes UK are doing, in my region, I cover the Midlands, 42 clinical commissioning groups. We put a vehicle in the middle of the town or city centre and we test 200 or 300 people over a 2-day period. High risk factors, height, weight, ratios, family background, and if they're high risk, then we'll refer them to their GP.
Do you find yourself walking down the street and looking at people and thinking, I wonder?
I do, but I try not to judge people. It may not be the reason that all their own fault that they're overweight. The fact that obesity is the single biggest cause of diabetes doesn't mean that everyone with diabetes is obese. But I think people can help themselves. They can choose healthier food options. They can grill and oven bake their food rather than frying everything. So a lot of the ownership is going to be on the patient.
Yeah. And you must drive past every drive-through, well-known name place for burgers and things, walk down the street, all the shops with all the fast food, and do you ever feel like going in and saying, look, why don't you buy the fruit, why don't you buy this, why don't you buy that?
It is very tempting to do that. On the other hand, I think they are trying to take corporate responsibility now and offering salads, and so there are options they're offering now, but that doesn't resolve the whole situation. No. I think it's so convenient for people just to go through a drive-through or just to walk past, rather than cooking their own and preparing their own healthy food.
I mean, working in an environment like this, you grab a sandwich, you grab a drink and things when you can. It's not good. In terms of kind of famous people who you can use to help get the message across, who have you used then?
Well, we've used Ian Botham's daughter.
Yeah,
has got diabetes.
I read about that at the weekend.
Yeah,
enough,
she's on an insulin pump, so she has a pump attached to her side to infuse the insulin. Joe Fraser, the famous boxer, obviously we can't use him, but he's got diabetes. Jasper Carrot's got diabetes. His daughter's got diabetes. They've worked with us in the past to try and raise the awareness. Wasim Akram, the ex-Pakistan cricket captain, he's got diabetes. Kapadev's got diabetes. A lot of famous people have got diabetes. Steve Redgrave, probably the most famous. 6 gold medals.
There can't be much wrong with his diet, can there? Goodness me.
No, that's not down to diet. And he trains very hard. He's got 6 gold medals. He injects himself 6 to 8 times a day with insulin. His wife's a GP. He's totally got it right. And he's an exemplar model for people with diabetes. And on the other hand, you get people like John Prescott, Jimmy Tarbuck, who've got diabetes, who perhaps could do something about their lifestyle. John Prescott has never looked as though he's had the best diet in the world, has he? But you look at somebody like Steve Redgrave then, so where's it come from with him? Is there any way of knowing? Yeah, his is probably more of a genetic background, I think, to diabetes. It may have run in his family. So there's a lot of research going on at the moment. Diabetes UK spends about £7 million on research into diabetes genetics. the increase in type 2 in children, and type 2 is traditionally associated with adults with diabetes. So why is type 2 in children increasing? It's their lifestyle, their Xboxes, their PlayStations, they're taking the easy option, fast foods, they're taking the bus rather than walking. So we're doing a lot of research at the moment, Diabetes UK, into trying to find the reasons why people like Redgrave have diabetes, why there's an increase in children with diabetes, and why there's 3.3 million people diagnosed with diabetes. This figure's set to double in the next 10 and 15 years, so we could have up to 6 million people. 10% of NHS expenditure is diabetes related.
That's a frightening thought, isn't it? Those numbers.
Yeah.
Absolutely frightening.
There's an epidemic of diabetes.
Yeah. So when you've got somebody like Steve Redgrave, I mean, obviously the hope is that people will look at him and think, well, how can a guy who looks like that have got a problem? And with your research as well, I mean, presumably it is difficult, isn't it, research? People are looking for miracle cures all the time, and there simply isn't one, is there?
There isn't a cure at the moment. The nearest cure at the moment is transplanting the whole pancreas so it's functioning properly, so the right levels of insulin are going into the body. The next nearest thing is something called cell islets that produce the insulin, so transplanting these cell islets. And there's a lot of research, it's very early stages yet. Our president at the moment, Richard Lane, he was one of the first people to have a cell islet transplant. He came off insulin, but unfortunately he's gone back onto insulin. So there isn't a cure yet at the moment, but there's hope. There's a lot of hope out there. There's a lot of research going on in university hospitals across this country. We work closely with the American Diabetes Association and the Australian one and the European ones, and there will be a cure one day, but it's not there yet.
And briefly, are you very careful what you eat, certainly when you're in the office?
Yes, we have to set the right example there, yes.
Yeah, and when you're in the car, you've got to put the chocolate and just give it to other people and not have any yourself, haven't you?
Yeah, I just eat salad in the car. So.
Obviously, yes.
A huge stigma. Just to give you a couple of examples. One managing director of a packing company phoned up and he said, one of my packers has diabetes, shall I sack him? At least he phoned up. And then, of course, with the younger age group of teenagers going to a nightclub, one of them pulls out a needle. Bouncer thinks he's doing something else with the needle, whereas all he wants to do is put some insulin in. There's a huge stigma, and what we need is these high-profile people to be more open about their diabetes. It's a bit like 9/10 of the iceberg. The less people are likely to want to admit it, the more the ignorance and then discrimination goes on.
I mean, you've mentioned one or two of the famous people. I'm probably guessing there are others who don't want people to know that they've got diabetes, and I'm not really sure why they don't want them to know. Yeah,
absolutely, and it's a stigma situation. Once again, we want the people to be more open about it, which will help, particularly the younger generation, particularly get the education in schools at an early stage as well. And we want to get all the key healthy living messages, healthy lifestyle interventions to make sure that those people who are undiagnosed. There was a survey recently about prevention where 11.5 million people could be pre-diabetes in the UK. So we need to get to those people before they develop diabetes. At the moment, 10% of NHS expenditure is related to diabetes. If we diagnose the figures double in the next 10 or 15 years, they probably won't be able to cope.
We mentioned about the fact that you may, if you've got problems with blurred vision and things. A couple of other things you mentioned to me. One of them was a problem with your feet that might be a bit of a clue along the way.
Yes, Diabetes UK advocates that people should know what care they should be receiving from their local healthcare professional. And we've produced a guide which is called the 15 Healthcare Essentials, and it includes getting your blood glucose levels measured, getting your blood pressure measured, having your eyes screened at least annually, having your cholesterol checked regularly, and the other one which you just mentioned, feet, is really, really important because diabetes can affect the circulation. If the circulation's not there, it can lead to neuropathy, it can lead to foot gangrene, ulcers, which eventually could lead to minor or major amputation. So it's really important people get their feet checked regularly.
Nowadays, pretty well anything that happens in life, they always say that there is a trauma team, there's an emotional team supporting them. Do people sometimes need support when they are diagnosed with diabetes?
Oh, absolutely. A lady in her 50s, type 2, got diagnosed last week, phoned our office up, and she was in floods of tears and said, well, I go blind next week. She really had no idea what having diabetes. It wasn't in her family. I think if you've got it in your family, there's less of an ignorance out there, but a lot of the time people get it out of the blue. So it's really important people have that psychological support, particularly on diagnosis, and then on the ongoing management of diabetes as well. And Diabetes UK has a number of local support groups that can provide that, but also there should be local healthcare professionals providing that level of support on diagnosis in practice.
It's, I mean, I'm not sure how long you've been with Diabetes UK, but I mean, you've clearly learnt a huge amount about what goes on. I mean, I know you need to for your job, but I mean, you talk about it in such a way that people should be engaged and people should be understanding what issues there might be out there for them.
Yeah, the public health should do more on prevention, and the local NHS, the local clinical commissioning groups should do more on raising awareness about the symptoms. They should do more on providing a better quality and equity of care across the whole of the area. One of the problems is that it is a postcode lottery, and it's very much depends on what care your healthcare professional is delivering, which is why people need to know what care they should expect. So if they're not receiving it, they can work with a healthcare professional to improve their quality of care.
And as with fundraising, you're all fighting for a bit of the same cake. Let me just tell people, if you're out and about anyway today, try and pick one of these up called 15 Healthcare Essentials from Diabetes UK. That answers pretty well every question you might have.